Thursday, July 20. Now saved by God. Read back through Ephesians 2, verses 1 to 10, focusing on Paul's conclusion in verses 8, 9 and 10. What points does he highlight as he concludes the passage? Let's start at verse 1. And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sin, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. But God, who is rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up together, and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace in his kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For, as it says in verse 8, by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. In verses 1 to 3, Paul documents that the salvation of the believers in Ephesus does not occur because of their good behaviour or winsome qualities. When the story begins, they are spiritually dead. There's not a spark of life or worth in them, as it said in verse 1, and you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sin. They have been utterly conquered by sin. They exhibit no personal initiative, but are led around by Satan himself and by their own base passions and mental delusions. Verses 2 and 3. In which you once walked according to the course of the world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. Unknown to them, they are in a far worse position than simply being without spiritual life or virtue. In company with all mankind, they are the enemies of the true God and are moving toward a day of destiny and divine judgment. They are children of wrath like the rest of mankind, as it said in verse 3. Instead of being rooted in their own qualities, their salvation is rooted in God's inexplicable love, a love that cannot be explained based on any worth in the object of that love. In mercy and love, God acts on their behalf in Christ Jesus, it says in verse 4, resurrecting them from spiritual death. Because of God's intervention, they experience an amazing itinerary that follows the trajectory of Jesus himself. From the extreme depth of utter spiritual death and grinding slavery, they are resurrected and conveyed to the heavenly places and seated with Christ on the cosmic throne, as we read in verses 5 and 6. This lightning-like divine intervention, though, is no momentary phenomenon. It has real staying power, eternal durability, because God intends to exhibit his grace toward them in Christ Jesus throughout all eternity, as it said in verse 7. In its conclusion, in verses 8 to 10, Paul goes back over this ground, wishing to ensure that his point sticks. The salvation of believers is a divine work, not a human one. It does not originate in us, but in God's gift. No human being can boast of having sparked it. We read in verses 8 and 9, standing in the grace of God, we believers are exhibits of his grace and only of his grace. We are his masterpieces, created by God, as it says in verse 10, in Christ Jesus. And so to finish the day, Why is it so important for us to understand that our salvation is from God and not rooted in our own worth or efforts? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.